Good afternoon, and thank you very much for those who are still with us.
But I do have.
I am Teresa Moreira. I am the head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, that probably most of you are not familiar with. But I'm extremely pleased to be here. Well, first of all, for personal reasons, pleased and proud to have been at the beginning of the Portuguese Competition Authority 20 years and a couple of months ago, when I joined as a member of the board with the president, Professor Abel Mateus, and the other member of the board, Engineer Lopes Rodrigues. And I'm very proud for what the authority has achieved, and especially personally proud for having contributed a little bit to the launch of a fully fledged independent authority, and also very glad to see so many of the bright and still young officials and experts that are with us today. Apart from this personal note, let me get to the business. So we are going to discuss recent trends in cartels. I would like to start by introducing the panel members, all very experienced. So here I have Elisabetta Iossa, who is a commissioner at the Italian Competition Authority and has had a fantastic academic background, of course, as in the field of economics. Then we have Tina Soreide, hope I'm pronouncing this right, Director General of the Norwegian Competition Authority, interestingly also a professor of economics, but with very large experience in development economics, having worked for the World Bank, the EU, and the OECD. And finally, last but not least, from our brother country of Portugal, that is to say from Brazil, Gustavo Freitas de Lima, who is a commissioner from the Brazilian Competition Authority, the Administrative Council for Economic Defense, better known by its acronym in Brazilian Portuguese, CADGI, sounds better. And the three of them will talk us a little bit about recent trends in cartels in their respective jurisdictions. But allow me a few words of introduction that I don't believe are necessarily needed because the audience is quite expert. But as all of you know, cartels are very serious and probably one of the most harmful anti-competitive agreements and infringements. They lead companies to share markets, to limit production or control production, to fix prices and other transaction conditions, and of course to restrict also imports and exports with very, very serious damages in the economies, which usually are assessed ex post with the decrease of prices after a certain cartel has been identified in a specific market. So there is, this is maybe one of the most current priorities as far as law enforcement is concerned of all competition authorities. And competition authorities, in order to identify, to detect, and to be able to fight cartels, have been improving techniques, developing tools, even digital tools, as we heard this morning, and I think we will hear a little bit this afternoon. And it's very interesting to see, of course, that cartels, which in my old time were even called hardcore cartels, which is like a pleonasm, I think, they are very heavily sanctioned, and sometimes in some jurisdictions, not I believe in these three cases, but they involve the imposition of criminal sanctions, as some of you will know. Leniency programs have been so far the most successful, I would say, common instrument developed by countries across the world in order to better encourage the identification and the prosecution of cartels, which of course tend to be secret. Let me also mention that in the area of public procurement, which is so important because of this goal to deliver value for money, practices of this nature, namely bid rigging, have been raising in the last decades as very serious types of cartels, and these again are becoming a priority for experienced competition authorities and young and small competition authorities. And finally, I wanted to say that, of course, with globalization and digitalization that followed, paved the way for cross-border cartels, which are also an important issue for competition authorities around the globe, but especially for those that are young and small and sometimes little experienced and more resource constrained. Of course, as we have heard already throughout the day, digitalization also has helped competition authorities to identify digital tools that allow for more precise and more reliable detection, and probably also to use in data analysis and information analysis that can facilitate launching and closing successfully cases. Now, why am I here? So let me just tell you that UNCTAD is the focal point for competition law and policy within the very vast United Nations system. We support developing countries in this area in using competition law and policy as a useful instrument for inclusive economic growth and sustainable development. We do policy advice, and it is our job to identify the best practices and disseminate them, hence the interest of this type of events. We have launched in 2021 an informal working group on cross-border cartels that some of you may be aware of, and where we have competition experts from representing countries, but also international organizations, practitioners, academics, and I wanted to invite all of you to join and share experiences, because that is the objective of this working group. But now, let me turn to my speakers. I will start with a first round, asking each one of the speakers to please share their experience of their competition authorities in fighting cartels, and also to share with us, if possible, challenges faced. I think, exceptionally or not, we have slides for this panel. I think we are the first panel to have slides. But I think when one thinks of cartels, you want to see figures and trends, hence the slides. So, Elisabetta, over to you, please.
Thank you, Teresa. Maybe I suppose this is So first of all, thanks, Teresa, for moderating this panel, and thanks to Nono for this kind invitation. Congratulations on this 20th anniversary and for putting together such an interesting event. Yes, so I took the opportunity of this panel to gather thoughts on what the Italian Antitrust Authority, which I've had the honor of joining a year and a half ago, has been doing since its establishment about 30 years ago. And perhaps it could help thinking of our strategies from 4 different perspectives. So a first one is related to what we've tried to do within the organization. In 2023, we established a cartel unit, so a dedicated unit to fight cartels. Beforehand, cartels were enforced. The enforcement of cartels was within different divisions divided by sectors, and now there is this dedicated unit, and we will see the impact of greater specialization in the coming years. We have just in the process of hiring 2 data scientists. We heard today a lot about the importance of enhancing competence. It's interesting that in Italy, following a very intense political debate on prices of airline tickets to Sicily, the government has just given us some new powers to actually intervene with structural remedies in case we see, following a market investigation, competition issues, and the use of algorithmic pricing is being indicated as a possible warning sign. So perhaps next year I'll have something to tell you about this new competence. We don't use empirical screening tools. We did it in 2014. We had a project, but we abandoned it. That was related to the fact that at that time we did not have information on the bids. So for us, that project was not justifying the resources we had put. However, recently we started some new collaboration with the anti-corruption authorities on different purposes, because we also have a competence to monitor the choice of tender versus direct awards in local public services by public entities, and we are looking at new data sets. So perhaps something will come in the future, but not now. So we have some novelty, I will think a positive one, in terms of incentives to report. I will mention the fact that the Italian authority has been doing most of its cases ex officio. So we expected initially that the application of the ECM Plus, allowing for criminal immunity, would have a positive impact on leniency, because in Italy it's a criminal offense to participate to bid rigging. Despite an initial positive sign, I cannot confirm that this has been the case. But the positive news has come from the introduction in 2022 of the whistleblower tool, the same as the one used by the Commission, which allows anonymous reports to be submitted, and more importantly, it allows an anonymous communication with those submitting it. And that has been, so far, already a source of 2 cartel cases, which we have opened, one in biofuel and one with fundraise. It's interesting, and there need to be food for thought to think why whistleblower is so effective, or maybe will be so effective compared to leniency, and what kind of incentives leniency program are not perhaps giving in Italy sufficiently for firms to come forward. Of course, whistleblowers can also be just employees of firms or buyers reporting suspected cartels from suppliers. We have introduced a settlement procedure, which we know could have the benefit of resource efficiency, saving times, although we know also from the experience of other authorities, especially in hybrid settlements, that it can be a source of complications. So we have it, but we have not used yet, and so the effects will be seen. One thing I would like to stress, which I think has been quite important for us, is the collaboration that we have with other public entities, and that has been critical for the fight on cartels. So first of all, we have good collaboration with public procurers. And this is very relevant, because remember that cartels, the C of cartels, very often comes with a C related to competence of public procurers, and the C related to corruption in public procurement in general. And the collaboration has been good, because thanks also through some initiatives that raised awareness, we've seen an increase in the number of cases where procurers could detect warning signs and reporting them to us. Competence, of course, is also important, because the way you design a tender, we know very well from procurement research, has an implication also on the possibility that a cartel becomes stable, is stable, and sort of and can the collusive rent can be shared. I'll come back to this later. We also have this memorandum of understanding with some public prosecutors, and this has been good because it allows exchange of information, and sometimes we've heard about cartels when they came one-to-one with corruption or other source of illegal behavior. And again, we know also from research that sometimes cartels the stability of cartel is aided by the presence of a public official who is complacent. So collaboration with those public entities who are enforcing legality also on this other dimension is very important. And for us, this has been particularly fruitful. So in terms of cases, I looked at the trend of cases. As I mentioned, most of our cases are ex officio. We've had 3-4 cartel cases per year. I mentioned that in the last 2 years we had 2 cases open thanks to this whistleblower tool. So I would, the feedback I have is extremely positive. Leniency cases instead are behind our cartel only in 11 of our closed cases. So I got this little slide looking at what type of cartels we've been seeing. And of course, these are not necessarily the cartels that are out there, but these are the cartels that we have detected. And you can see that bid rigging is the largest, is about 50%. And there was a boost, as I mentioned, after this awareness campaign and the issuing of some publication identifying red flags and discussion with public prosecutors. We've had a number of price-fixing cartels. These are the ones only since 2015 in this picture. Some market sharing cartels, information exchange, one buyer cartel, and a cartel within an environmental consortia, and some outward restriction. The structure of these cartels has been is quite interesting, I think, because in Italy these are mainly typical cartels. We don't have no poach agreements. The Portuguese authority has been the first in Europe having one. No wage fixing agreements. This perhaps is linked to the fact, as in many other parts of Europe, that trade unions are very strong and able to detect issues there. But perhaps it's also linked to the structure of our industry that comprises a lot of small and medium-sized firms, with cartels taking place really within associations of undertakings, including cooperatives, compliance consortium, and joint venture. And we've also been able very often to identify significant paper trail, which is surprising in a sense, but it may come from the fact that many cartels took place within small and medium-sized firms. There is a picture in the slide where the cartelists were meeting just outside motorway stations. We found all the evidence about this, and then they had all this paper where they were sharing the market, fixing the prices, and taking note of who was getting what and at which price. It's been good, and then I'll stop for this first round, that at a time where authorities were asked to do something to fight inflation, we had a couple of cartel cases, one on biofuel and one on fuel distribution, which was important in terms of communication, telling people, using our normal instruments, we give a little bit of contribution also to the crisis that we have been seeing.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm already thinking of some questions for the second round. But now let me ask Tina to share the Norwegian experience also in this area, because even though, of course, you are very close to the European competition network, you are a part, even though you are not a EU member state, I'm sure that your economic structure may have other highlights different than Italy. Over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. And thank you so much for the invitation. I am so happy to be here. Our cooperation with the Portuguese Competition Authority has been very important for us in Norway, inspiring and enriching in many ways. With respect to cartel enforcement, I thought I should say something about 3 trends that we in the Norwegian Competition Authority feel that we are part of. And I want to start with an ongoing case that illustrates an important trend that increasingly firms might benefit from digital infrastructures to coordinate prices in new ways, as we have heard. So we have a case that illustrates this point in the quite concentrated Norwegian grocery markets, so where we investigate whether the 3 major grocery chains collude illegally. Food prices in Norway are among the highest in the world. So we issued a statement of objections in December 2020, warning that the case might lead to fines totaling 2 billion euros. That's record high in a Norwegian context. I don't think there's been any corporate fines above around 100 million euros. So this is, 2 billion euros on 3 companies. And it's very hard to reduce the penalty, because if we want to comply with the operating according to the EU guidelines. We plan to complete the case very soon. So what we allege is that there is an agreement in the bottom that give each chain access to vast amounts of price information in a manner that make it possible for each of them to adapt and ensure that they can coordinate extremely quickly. So the agreement says that each company has access to each other's grocery stores at agreed hours, and they have an opportunity to scan all shelf prices using modern tools. And this happens in other countries, but the thing is that they use tools that allow them to collect prices that are transferred straight back to their own business systems, where digital arrangements may help them immediately update their own prices. And so they have massive amounts of current prices gathered frequently. They do it frequently at pre-agreed times, predictably, and large quantities. And we allege that this is a sort of a information exchange that reduces the uncertainty about competitors' price setting, and we find it reasonable to expect it might have caused higher grocery prices. And this far in our investigation, we consider the practice violation by object and by effect. So the case, which is under investigation, so it's not concluded, seems to illustrate how digital solutions, possibly by the use of algorithms, may facilitate coordination, even if the information shared is real-time prices and not future prices. So because of digitalization, because of the massive amounts and the frequency, we say that this is harmful because each company can predict and they know when they can expect price changes. So even if the accused grocery chains maintain that the price information is useful to compete vigorously, we find that there is a clear risk that this is coordination. So there is such a complexity when considering grocery prices, we may have many thousand products at the same time. So for humans, it's extremely hard to assess the facts, and at the same time, we think it can be quite simple for the companies to use these tools, modern digital solutions to coordinate. So, and such trends, coming to the second trend, is that we see, that we are part of, is that given such new opportunities to coordinate, it has motivated us, like many other agencies, to upgrade our own enforcement systems, like in Italy and in Spain, in the UK, in many other countries. So we too have recruited data scientists. We have a machine learning platform so we can study patterns in new ways. We want to conduct more efficient market surveillance. And we build on former work. We did some years ago a comprehensive study of whether Norwegian companies actually use algorithms, which they did. That was in 2021, and that work was inspired by work by the Portuguese Competition Authority, which did such a report before us. And so we are developing now a hub internally for data and analysis, like others do. And as part of that trend, we too cooperate with other agencies. We learn from the OECD, from the ECN, ICN, and so on. So I think that is important to mention. And the third trend that I would like to mention, also inspired by our colleagues in Portugal, relates to how we and other authorities are starting to become more aware of how coordination between firms may harm workers. So such sorts of collusion between companies may be very profitable, especially if it means a ceiling on wages. And also if it means that it can prevent valuable workforce from leaving and so on, we think it might impede innovation, and it may facilitate coordination downstreams. Such practices may be in violation of competition law, but in Norway we never had an enforcement case. So the Portuguese Competition Authority did some very useful work in this field. They did a report which resulted in enforcement cases. And now in Norway we cooperate very closely with the other Nordic countries, and we develop a joint report on no-poach agreements and whether anti-competitive agreements may harm the workers, and we think it plays out differently in the Nordic context because of a high degree of unionization. So we start by a report and advocacy, and then we think that will be a very good basis for enforcement. So, and this is a trend that I see it's played out in several countries, and I think that is also worth mentioning when we consider trends in cartel enforcement. So, with these remarks, I pointed at 3 trends that I feel that we in Norway are part of. So, new theories of harm because of digital evolution. Second, the reorganizations that we see across the world for more efficient enforcement. And third, coordination with labor market consequences.
Thank you very much, Tina. Very interesting, and I think very appropriate also to share the recent trends of the Portuguese Competition Authority with this mention. Now, Gustavo, over to you. You are, apart from me, the only other lawyer in this panel, and you come from CAGI tribunal, which is also very specific. What would you like to share with us regarding your experience in Brazil?
Muito obrigado, boa tarde a todos. Thanks so much, it's a great pleasure to be here. As Teresa mentioned, the relationship between Brazil and Portugal is somehow special, and so it's a great pleasure to be here and to celebrate the 20th anniversary of ADC. So we're speaking a little bit about recent trends on cartel. The first thing I always mention when I talk about cartels is that cartels is not two bakers discussing the price of bread. Cartels is organized crime, somehow with involvement with corruption, sometimes with violent crime, threats, so it's not something that we should take lightly. Well, regarding Teresa's question, CADES has a very specific configuration. We have a tribunal. I'm one of the commissioners in the tribunal, so we are the ones that do the rulings and judge the cases, and we have the final word regarding convictions. We have a different body inside CADE, which is called the General Superintendency, Superintendência Geral, which is the investigation body. So they are separate, they're independent. As a commissioner, you have a mandate, so you're appointed by the president, you're confirmed by the Senate, you have a fixed term, and we do the final ruling of the cases. In Brazil, it's possible to challenge that ruling on the judiciary, in the judicial review, but it's very limited because you cannot discuss on the merits. So because of our Supreme Court ruling, that judicial review is very limited to due process of law and burden of evidence. So that's somehow what we're focusing right now in the tribunal, getting it right, especially regarding the standard of proof. So I'm going to show you some statistics, nothing better than to have some numbers to support what you're saying. So first of all, all the statistics here comes from 2022, but I can tell you right now that 2023, the numbers are very similar. So we have opened 27 procedures last year. 6 of them are in preliminary phase, 10 investigations, and 11 process. So process are the more developed one, the ones that we already have a charge against the company. 11 procedures were judged by the tribunal, meaning it was a final decision. 1 of them was filed, meaning no convictions. All the other 10 led to convictions, even total convictions or partial convictions. What I mean by partial convictions is that some of the accused were innocent and some of the accused were convicted. And it resulted in, that's a figure I wanted to show you that's quite important on the trend. It resulted in 35.2 million fines, which is a substantial decrease. So we're going to say, well, why are you pointing that out? That is a substantial decrease in the fines. Because of the next number. We had 32 agreements resulting in $274.5 million in agreements. $145 million are regarding previous agreements, meaning the agreement was done before it was taken to the tribunal, and $130 million was during the trial in the tribunal. So what I mean by that is that most of our penalties, most of our fines are actually decided on the agreement. And this is a big trend. I will show you some numbers to expose that. But the fines that we actually issue are the minority, we are the less companies in the process. We had 2 down raids last year. Usually that's the number that we are not actually changing that number. It's usually 2 or 3 down raids every year. And we have 1 leniency. I will speak a bit more about that. This is 2022. Actually, the number this year is double that. So we have 2 leniencies this year. But I will show the general tendency. This is the number I was mentioning before. This is the payments on agreements. So if you check, well, this is a yearly number. So to check the number of 2020, 2021, and 2022, there were an explosion of agreements. The main reason for that, it was very deliberate to CADE to try to reach a solution by agreement. We have been doing a great effort in standardization of our penalties, of our fines, meaning they are more predictable now. So what we have observed is the moment that we have a fine that's easier to be calculated, it's easier to settle the cases because the lawyers, they know what they're paying, they know they can convince their clients it's going to be a good deal. We actually issued this year a new guidelines regarding penalties, so we're trying to get it together. This is the number of leniency per year. 2017 was the peak. Actually, a large part of this number, it's 21 leniency agreements, it's a large number. It comes from car wash operations. So car wash, Lava Jato, was a very huge operation regarding anti-corruption in Brazil. It started in 2014, and then we peaked the leniency program in 2017, and then the numbers are coming lower, and now it's 1 or 2 a year. It's a general tendency in the worldwide, but the next slide will explain a little bit what's going on here. So yes, the leniency program is decreasing the number, but what's going on is that we now have a bigger interest in leniency plus. So the blue number is the requested number, and the green number is the numbers that we actually approve the leniency plus. So it clearly shows that there is a big interest for companies to making a leniency plus agreement. In Brazil, we have 3 different standards for agreements. Leniency is basically no fines, no convictions. You just cooperate, give your best, and you're not going to be punished. We just allow 1 leniency per case. It's not possible to have a second leniency. Leniency plus means the company does not qualify for leniency, usually either because we already have 1 lenient in the case, or second one is because we're already investigating the case. So if ICAD already knows by the case, if we're already investigating, looking into it, we do not accept the leniency. So what you're going to do is a leniency plus. What it means is that you're not going to get out by not paying something, you're going to plead guilty, you're going to pay a fine, it's a smaller fine, but you're going to pay a fine, and then you provide evidence on something that we do not know. So basically what's going on is that the leniency program is decreasing, but the leniency plus program 2022 we had very good numbers. It's probably going to take us a while to judge all that. This is the time for process conclusion. So this is a pizza slide. The larger slice here is 5 to 10 years. So most of our cases that are being judged right now, it took 5 to 10 years between beginning the investigation and closing that in the tribunal. We have the dark green is less than 5 years, so this is a very good number as we feel. And the blue number is over 10 years, which is not a very good number. We have a limitation in our law for 12 years. Of course, it could go more than that because you could interrupt this time schedule, but it's actually not good when you take more than 10 years to judge a case. Most of this is delay. This is a number that we are trying to improve. We want to have most of our cases under 5 years. Most of this delay is notification, and the reason for that is that we have a lot of cartels where the executives live in Europe, in Japan, in the US. It takes a long time. You need the Interpol to notify that, and sometimes you stop 2 or 3 years the cartel because you need to get everybody in the same process, and you need to redo a lot of evidence because when you reach out and the people come to defend, they want to review the testimony, and it takes a while. So this is something that we need to work on, especially for the physical persons. So, well, I'm going to close now and just try to elaborate a little bit on the numbers that I just displayed. So the tendency that we have in CADE right now is trying to solve most of our cases under agreement. We have recent decisions by the tribunal trying to separate evidence because of our experience with the leniency. What we perceived during car wash and the consequence of car wash is what you could call it like the sentence trial. What I mean by that is that one leniency starts to provide evidence that they believe the investigation wants. Some of them are not completely true, some of them are exaggerations, and then the effect multiplies. So the next one, they want to get free as well, so they start to making up or exaggeration evidence, and then you have a long line of evidence that are not good, that are not in the standard. So CAD has a very recent precedent on Denso case. Denso case was an automobile cartel. Denso provided, at the time, among other companies, cooling systems for cars. They were accusing of splitting the market in like radiators, fans, stuff like that. And what happens that we had one lenient and one agreement in this case. Basically, they were the biggest two companies. They both plead guilty, and they said, oh, by the way, Denso was with us. And the problem with this case is that the evidence was not good. And that's what we call the unilateral evidence. So unilateral evidence, what we mean by that is that the lenient provides this evidence, but it's not confirmed by a third source. So in Denso case, Denso was not convicted. The case was dismissed, specifically because the evidence provided by the leniency could not be confirmed by a third party. Actually, one of the evidence they provided was proven false. They provided evidence regarding a meeting that the executive that was supposed to be in that meeting was not even in the country in that specific date and time. But so after the Denso case, CADI started to establish this precedent where we would not convict a company based on leniency, based on this evidence provided by the other companies, if this could not be confirmed by third parties. At the same time, we started admitting indirect evidence. So in Brazil, we do not look at the effects of cartels. Basically, if you prove the collusion, if you prove the direct evidence that the company are contacting each other and fixing price or something like that, we stop that, and that's a cartel, and we do not seek to any further. But in some cases, what we're doing now is proving the cartel because we could not establish the direct contact between companies. We prove the cartel using indirect evidence, and then sometimes we are using economical evidence. We had a very recent case, it was just last year, where we proved the case. We had no evidence the company was contacting each other. But we could prove the case based on two things. First of all, typos. It was a public bidding. They have provided different offers with the same typos. Well, thank God people still do that. Maybe ChatGPT will correct that. But the second evidence was actually economical evidence. We could prove that the offers were so close together that it could not be answered by any other means, meaning the offers was so similar in different items of the bidding that it could not be by chance. And this is the first time that we have a conviction that was solely based in indirect evidence and no single evidence of direct contact. On the other hand, we had a case where we had direct evidence of contact, but we dismissed it based on the indirect evidence. This case was interesting because it was two gas stations. They were communicating with each other. We actually had the messages of what they are talking. And the message, one of the gas station owners said, look, I believe your price is too low. And that's the message. I believe your price is too low. And the answer was, I see. Which in Portuguese is vejo, which is something that you could interpret in multiple ways, meaning I see that I'm going to do something about it, or just don't bother me and do your own price. And in that specific case, we had, of course, this doubt in the case, and we looked into the economical evidence. Meaning, well, what happened after this conversation? Did they actually raise the price? What has he done? And of course, there was no change in the prices after this conversation, and the case was dismissed because even though there was a direct contact, even though they were discussing prices, clearly one of the parties had nothing to do with that. And so it was not treated as a cartel. So I believe I will end here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. I think you already covered the examples and everything.
Okay.
So I would like now to come back to Tina and Elisabetta. Tina, you mentioned a very important sector, especially in the context of the current cost of living crisis, the grocery market. Any other example? Because I think, well, unfortunately, I think one can find or identify cartels in different areas of the economic activity. But it is true that a case brought in a sector that concerns us all as citizens, as consumers, sometimes also conveys a very powerful message for the society to understand the benefits of competition and of strong and vigorous competition law enforcement. And so I wanted to ask you if there's any other case you would like to mention. And I thought if you could expand a little bit on what you are doing now with this investment, the second trend you mentioned, because I think that is very interesting to explore. Yeah. The data scientists you hired and the market surveillance. Actually, Brazil, to my knowledge, has developed something called BRAIN, translated from Portuguese, which was a digital tool to better identify serious anti-competitive practices. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, thank you, Clarissa. Here's a lot to comment on, but I will try to be structured. So I think you raise an important point that big markets, food prices, interest rates, mortgage loans, expenses that matter a lot to a lot of people should be an indicator that we should focus on markets that are important. So this is why I think it is extremely important to address a very, very challenging case in the food market, even if it is a risky case for us to address. Also, when it comes to banks, I think we are just considering it very, very carefully because the prices are very high, there's some concentration. So we are looking into the market. So I think we should be kind of steered by where does it seem to be a problem and not only driven by the evidence. So I think that is, but of course that's hard in practice. So, and you mentioned trends, and I want to say that, yes, we are concerned about new forms of coordination, and we want to be updated on new forms of enforcement. We want to use the most modern forms of sophisticated analysis and data, and we know that companies can coordinate in new ways, and they use sharing of information as competitive advantage. But if you allow me, I think I will use the opportunity to point at some of the trends that I am very concerned about in this picture, because I think there are especially 3 trends that raise some reasons for concern. For example, if we look at our ability to enforce competition law in cases of large companies and bid rigging, and you mentioned in the introduction hardcore cartels. I'm looking at the trends. If we look at the United States, and which is traditionally a front runner in antitrust enforcement, we heard earlier this morning that they have many class action processes on algorithm collusion, and that's good. But the DOJ does not seem to go against large domestic and international cartels. The cases they have are smaller, and if the US, as they normally are, they are a front runner and we are kind of lagging a bit behind, that is not a good sign. Secondly, I think one thing that I'm concerned about is the use of settlements in these cartel cases. Of course, it's impressive with the high number, and it's good. And it's also very important that in settlement cases, companies have to admit infringements. They had to at least admit the facts of the case. Still, a settlement is an agreement, and both the company and enforcement agency benefits. But in these situations, when enforcement agencies carry the burden of the proof, there is a risk that the company benefits the most. And that is something that I think is a very in cartel cases, because settlements can be tempting solution, and we are in the same situation as in Italy, starting to consider how to use it. But I'm also worried that it is a slippery slope towards weaker enforcement, less weaker deterrence. And thirdly, leniency applications. Several countries report about a decrease in leniency applications, and that could be an expected result of the damage directive. But there is also a risk that companies feel confident that they will not face consequences of their illegal acts, or they assume that they will not be detected at all. And why should they seek leniency if they will not be detected? So mentioning this, I am happy about the willingness to enforce that Olivier spoke about this morning, and the executive order from the Biden administration, and the Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe. I see there's a lot of opportunities, but at the same time, as competition authorities strive to strengthen traditional law enforcement approaches, so increasing detection rates, imposing high enough penalties, offer sharp benefits that provide the necessary incentives to self-report. So I think it's important that we not only upgrade our ability to use data, but I think it's also important that we consider regulatory developments. So many countries are considering market investigation with an opportunity to impose structural remedies, like we do in Norway, Denmark, Germany, like they already had for a long time in the UK, which I think is a kind of safety net. When we are not able to detect cartel cases, maybe we can deal with the market in that way. Another way, I think that I think is important that we consider is what Frédéric Cheny mentioned that we should ought to consider allocation of the burden of proof, and whether we can tilt some more responsibility onto the company, as they do in the regulation of industrial safety, where companies have to prove that the new way of business practice will not harm society. So I will leave it with that, but you raised several questions, Teresa, so I could mention several of my concerns.
Thank you very much. I think that was very interesting. I think clearly the trend that we have seen is the combination of a number of instruments, of course, vigorous law enforcement, and because of the deterrence effect and the need to have, well, an effective application of competition law, hence the leniency, I suppose the whistleblower that I will ask Elisabetta about. But you are quite right. I think at least as far as digital market or digital ecosystems are concerned, and now with AI, I think I would suggest in this side of the Atlantic at least, I would suggest that there is a consensus that there is also the need to some sort of regulation. And I thought Cristina Cafara put it very strongly and personally, exactly as I would have suggested it. I'm not sure, it's quite interesting to see so many developments in the US, but it is true that until maybe the Biden administration, the US antitrust enforcement regarding digital big tech was not so active as in Europe. So it's interesting also to see these developments and this evolution. Thank you. Very good points and very good suggestions. Elisabetta, back to you to hear about any highlights you would like to share. And I was very curious about, well, a number of things you mentioned, but namely this relationship between small, if I understood correctly, let's say, less important leniency cases, but whistleblower as an instrument on the rise. I thought it was also interesting that you mentioned this in relation to the structure of the Italian economy. Frankly, I think in Portugal, which is obviously a smaller economy than the Italian one, we've always said that maybe 90% of our economic structure is based on small and medium-sized companies. And then you look at the huge EU market by comparison with Portugal, and you see there is a high percentage of small and medium-sized companies. I have the impression we are not always talking about the same companies, but in any case, because you mentioned this, and could you comment on that? And of course, share any other ideas you had already prepared and have not yet covered.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Teresa. Perhaps, yes. So going back to leniency, I mean, these are questions. I don't have the answer. The numbers are really too small and to really draw any conclusions. It's positive, I think, that we've seen this. We've opened 2 cases on whistleblowing with the whistleblowing tool. Perhaps this would be the last. Perhaps the trend will increase. We will see. We've seen, so we've been wondering why is that the case, why there is a benefit from anonymity that is so strong. Now we know from the literature on whistleblowing in general, and that very often those who blow the whistle and they have to put their face, they cannot keep anonymity, have been subject to a lot of retaliation. And there is a concern that retaliation may take place also at firm level. So in that regard, perhaps these whistleblowers are people working within companies, but perhaps they are the firms that are using this instrument, avoiding any risk of retaliation because of anonymity.
But at the same time, sorry to interrupt, at the same time not really benefiting. So it's not.
Well, if they are not part
yes.
of the cartel,
Yes.
so maybe a cartel that doesn't not include all of them, or maybe a cartel, partial cartel that was sustained with some sort of complacent public authorities, if you're talking about bid rigging, or maybe it's buyers who are being damaged by the harmed by the suppliers. So these are, again, questions. One thing we think is that the fact that we find so much paper trail when we do our down rates suggests that maybe there is not yet enough awareness among small and medium-sized firms, and maybe the ones benefiting from leniency programs are the big ones. So these are just food for thoughts. I think in any case it's good to have this additional instrument. And I'll keep you up to date as to how things develop. I wanted to share some more thoughts on bid rigging, because the Italian authority, I think, has quite a lot of experience on this. As I mentioned in the slides, they account for about 50% of our cartel cases since 2015, and they have all been opened ex officio. And for someone like me who's been working on public procurement for many years, this is an important achievement. And I think there is a lot that can be done by sort of, as I mentioned, collaborating with public procurers and by making them aware of the warning signs. There's been a quite interesting paperwork done by the OECD, by World Bank, by a number of other authorities identifying these warning signs. And what we have found is that, despite the fact that, of course, cartelists don't want antitrust authorities to guess how they are organizing their cartel, and therefore they have all the incentives to find new ways of compensating each other and divide the pie. We find a lot of the things that have been identified in the theory as the one that really, take place. So, for example, we've had cases where the cartel was used joint bidding, even though perhaps it was not strictly necessary that they would submit a joint bid as a way to find a compensatory mechanism to share the collusive pie. Because, of course, in bid rigging is different than other cartels, because with other cartels, the cartelists can all get the collusive rent at the same time. In bid rigging, they have to find a compensatory mechanism. They identify a designated bidder, but the non-designated one need to be compensated. Now, sometimes this compensation happens within the tender, and that is the case, for example, if public procurers use division in lots and they are not competent enough to know that you should not have a number of lots that is greater than the number of potential competitors, otherwise they just share the lots among themselves. Or, for example, there is a concern with subcontracting. We've seen cases where they use subcontracting as a way to compensate non-designated bidders, precisely as the theory would suggest. We have also been able sometimes to identify, which is definitely more complicated and tells us that public procurers cannot be always the one reporting warning signs, because sometimes compensatory mechanisms do not happen within a tender, but across tenders. So maybe they decide, you get this client, I get another client. So the single public procurer is not able to see anomalies. And perhaps there are many firms submitting bids through cover bids, okay? If you manage to get a broad perspective as an authority by actually investigating and monitoring certain markets, or if you have a centralized authority, we have this in Italy, which by its very nature, given that it centralizes procurement, it can have a broad perspective, then you sort of can complement the incentives of a procurer to report. But as some research also has highlighted, in any case, the incentives of public procurers can never be optimal in the sense of being sufficient compared to what will be in the interest of society, because there are all these externalities that do not internalize, and that's where antitrust authorities should fill the gap. So I want to mention again the 3 C's I like a lot: competence, cartels, and corruption, because I think the Italian authority has been extremely active on making this link very clear. So we are using advocacy intervention. We have a different number of instruments, but we've been using it a lot, for example, precisely to intervene in public tenders, making public procurers aware that the way they were designing a tender was perhaps going to lead to a cartel, or perhaps going to lead also, of course, to insufficient competition. We have overall, in terms of advocacy intervention, about 90 advocacy interventions a year, which is really a lot. And internally, of course, as an economist, I look at impact all the time, and I'm happy that the authority does this regularly since a few years. So we have looked also at the success rate of these advocacy interventions, and we found that about 66% of public entities receiving our recommendations will follow them at least partially. And this is helping public procurers becoming more competent. And it's good also in Italy that a system of qualification for public procurers has been introduced whereas you need to be more qualified to manage bigger tenders, which again is something that could help on the fight of cartels. The profile of interventions we had in advocacy, as I mentioned, sometimes were related to perhaps political opportunism or corruption. Sometimes were related to the risk of cartels. We can see when a tender is not designed in a way which we think is good for competition, but we don't always know why. So you can see here, for example, that many of our interventions have been precisely on the choice by the authority on the number of lots to divide the contract with, or the excessive use of geographic limitations that could favor certain firms, precisely the local one, or perhaps on the use of the award criteria and the way they were designed, which again could favor certain firms. And again, corruption, and political opportunism can go hand in hand with cartels, making them more stable. The very last thing perhaps I would like to mention, because I know this is, as far as I know actually, this is a unique feature in the Italian authority, is this legality rating system. So this was a competence that we were given back in 2012, which is to manage this legality rating system that allows companies to submit a request to us to be certified in terms of compliance to certain legality standards. The competence was given to us because one of the legality standards is antitrust violation. So if a firm was involved in a cartel, then they cannot obtain the certification for a number of years. They cannot obtain it also if they have committed other illegal behavior. I refer again to corruption, but maybe some tax issues, and consumer protection violation. And I think this has been good, although again, we don't have evidence to be very precise, as a deterrence tool for firms. And it's interesting to see that there is a growing and growing interest on this tool. More than 10,000 firms have applied, because public procurers are now using it to award additional points in the tender to those firms who have a legality rating certification and have higher points. And this is giving them like a premium if they are not involved in a cartel, and offers, therefore, a complementary tool to a debarment. We discussed this a lot in the OECD, and Tina has also done some work on this, which is something to consider as opposed, or maybe as a complementary tool to debarment. By the way, some research has also shown that legality and efficiency sometimes come one-to-one, in the sense that those firms, looking at a data set of Italian firms, those firms who had higher legality rating were also the ones who would perform better in the procurement in terms of lower delays and lower cost overrun. It's not causality, it's just a correlation, so it could be due to a third factor that is moving both. But again, I think it's food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is extremely important, and thank you for sharing such interesting details on public procurement. Let me say that I know that the Portuguese Competition Authority has invested quite intensively also in raising awareness, in doing advocacy on public procurement already in the last couple of years, going near those who open tenders throughout the country to raise awareness, and also, let's say, intensifying that collaboration that you mentioned. And I think this is a very good example of also conveying how competition matters to all of us as citizens, to all businesses, how this can be of great impact and value. And it's clearly a very important issue. Well, I think we still have maybe 1 or 2 minutes, because we only had questions in the morning. I know it has been a very intense and full day, but if the organizers allow me, I would just ask if there is somebody in the audience that would like to take this opportunity to ask our brilliant speakers any question, any clarification. I cannot really see much with the lights. or maybe this has been actually a very long and intense and full and interesting day. Oh, there is one there? Oh, sorry, thank you. Could you get the microphone? Sorry, I could hardly see you.
My name is Francisco. Just a question of curiosity, either to Tina or others. How do you see the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Producing Country, how this can affect how the agencies look at this cartel?
On petroleum producing.
He's talking about the organization of oil-producing countries that, of course, decides on the level of, it's exactly what I described initially, limit production
May I
and
take
control
this one?
markets.
Actually, I believe the first session that I had in Cadiz Tribunal, I mentioned that specifically OPEC situation, because we were right in the rise of the oil problem. The main problem with OPEC is that it's organized by countries, and most of our jurisdiction would not bring a case against a whole country. You need to charge a company, or you need to charge a person. I know that the US were trying to change this legislation, they were trying to challenge that, and actually threatening to bring some countries to the court. Of course, even if you do that, how are you going to enforce it? I mean, if you apply penalties to Saudi Arabia or Russia, how do you plan to collect that? But what I believe we could do, and this is what the case in Cadi, is basically say, look, it's not okay for companies to just follow the prices established for OPEC. I mean, if you're a company, you're not free to just say, oh, look, OPEC is diminishing their production, so I'm going to diminish my production as well. Or engage in some kind of commitment. Because oil is a commodity. If you have more oil in the market, the prices are going to drop. That's basic economy. So usually what you need to do to keep the prices high is to decrease production. So what I believe could be done among the countries is basically checking if the companies are engaging that kind of behavior. And if that's the case, you could start an investigation. But that's a very, I would say, very sensitive geopolitical problem that unless we have a collective initiative on that, meaning gathering a lot of agencies to focusing on that, I don't think it could be solved. And if I may, this is something, you're raising a legit problem that when we're talking about cartels, sometimes I get puzzled why we would have so much effort discussing digital markets collusion, which is something that we're basically not finding in the market yet. Cadi has looked into a few. If you're talking about abuse of dominance, it's a different story. But cartels regarding digital platforms, we're not finding them yet, or at least very few evidence. So why would we focus on that when we know there are so many other cartels operating? And you're giving a very good example. I know Cadi has more than 20 convictions just on oil and gas. We do have cases regarding power plants, pacemakers. So maybe there are some traditional cartels that we already know that are operating, that maybe we should focus so much on this one.
Thank you. Tina, any comment?
Yes, of course. So Norway is an oil-producing country, and I've been working on development economics. So of course I have some concerns, but I want to use the opportunity to mention 2 points. And one is that in OPEC and oil production, and also companies coming from my own country are involved in productions elsewhere that can be very harmful. And considering cartel enforcement, one of the things I wanted to mention is that it is very national. We are focusing on what's happening within our own borders. What our companies do in other countries, that's not necessarily subject to enforcement. So if companies from a European country, for example, from Norway, is operating in an African country, the enforcement may be quite weak when it comes to potential involvement in collusion, and the home country may profits substantially. So I think that is one concern that he kind of reminds me of. And a second concern relates to the problem of corruption, also picking up on what Elizabeth Betta spoke about, and also the fact that we are in Portugal, and the first news that I saw when I came to Lisbon was this extremely serious situation with the Portuguese Prime Minister indicted and investigated on corruption, which is something that could happen in any country. And this is also something, it is related to oil-producing regimes where we see higher levels of corruption and which causes a difficulty of enforcing competition law if the competition authorities are not independent enough. So I just wanted to remind about this difficulty and the contextual factors that are so important for us to go after the big cartels, and that not all countries have that opportunity. So even if I speak on, it's not really related directly to the question, but it's still related to the team.
Thank you. Elisabetta, any thoughts?
No, but perhaps I will pick on what Tina was saying in terms of priorities. I think it's very good that authorities can set priorities, and deciding whether to open a case when there is a sign that perhaps there is a small cartel. It's a choice that you have to make, taking into account a number of objectives. One is resource efficiency, because sometimes you pursue a cartel and it's really a small one, but you also want to have some deterrence, especially if you have a country where the SMEs, they can have a deterrence effect, can take place even if the cartel is more. We had, as I mentioned earlier, a cartel in the fuel distribution industry, and it was important, I think, to pursue the case, although it was relatively small, at a time where people were very much concerned about fuel prices. So I think you need to, of course, we are here and we need to always be very careful how we exercise our power, and we should not abuse it. We are becoming more and more powerful, I can see, in the sense of new instruments, new procedures, and so on. And of course, we need to be independent, but maybe one of the criteria we can use when we set priorities is also to look at sectors where, at that particular moment in time, there is a lot of attention, precisely because of what's happening in the country. So, all these different elements need to be considered. And as far as I know, we do it. We definitely, and the Italian authority, we do it, I'm sure, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tina, for mentioning the cross-border dimension. I should say that from the point of view of an organization that has 195 countries, several of which, despite having adopted competition law and policy, are not necessarily very big or very resourceful and maybe less experienced. That is indeed an issue. Another conclusion I would just suggest is that clearly, of course, we started talking about the hottest topic, artificial intelligence. But it is true that despite the importance of digital ecosystems in competition authorities' day-to-day enforcement and investigation life, we still find a lot of what I would call bread and butter cases, so cartel cases. And these are extremely important. They cover all sectors of economy, are extremely harmful for consumers, for business users, for the economy. So I'm very happy that we've heard from these excellent speakers on their very good experience. Please join me in a round of applause. Thank you again for your attention.